For the first time in 12 years, the Winchester came off the wall. John Miller didn't aim carefully. He aimed once, at the black figure running toward his cabin door, and pulled the trigger. It was early January in Pine Hollow, the kind of winter that buried fences and whispered through the cracks of old timber like ghosts searching for warmth. Snow curled at the edges of the windows, and the wind howled like it remembered something terrible. John had lived here alone since '72, high up past where wagons dared go. A man didn't need a town when he had a well, firewood, and silence. But silence never was, empty it echoed. That night, while tending the fire, he heard something no wind could make. A cry, not a coyote's yip, not wind through pine, a human cry, sharp, thin, and desperate. He grabbed the rifle out of instinct, then hesitated just a moment. Memories had teeth, and his bit deep. He could still smell the smoke, hear the screams in Chiricahua. He could still see the child's eyes, wide and unblinking, as her world burned. He'd carried that image, a raw, festering wound, for over a decade. It was the reason for his solitude, his penance. But the sound came again, closer now, a thread of fragile life pulling him from his self-imposed grave. Then she appeared. A girl, small, barely more than a shadow against the white drift. Her arms flailed once as she stumbled forward, barefoot, blood on her brow. Then she collapsed. He moved before he could think, the old rifle a forgotten weight in his hand as he closed the distance. He'd vowed to never intervene again, to never bear witness to another tragedy. But some vows are meant to be broken. The door slammed shut behind them as he dragged her in, leaving a crimson trail across the wooden floor. She was light, too light, the kind of weight that made you think of graves more than rescue. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. John laid her near the hearth and checked her pulse. Faint. Her skin was cold, mottled blue where the blood had pooled. He wrapped her in the buffalo hide he hadn't used since his wife left, the scent of cured leather and old grief mingling in the air. Her lips were blue, her hands scarred. Burnt? He stoked the fire harder, setting kindling like he was fighting time itself, a desperate prayer in his calloused hands. Then he peeled off the torn outer garment she wore, revealing more bruises, more cuts. That's when he saw it. Embroidered into the hem of her cloak, stitched in faded red thread, was the mark of the White Mountain Apache. His breath caught. Not because of what it was, a symbol of a people he'd been ordered to fight, but because he remembered that same symbol, in firelight, long agoon, a night when flames danced over the roofs of a village he couldn't save. A night when his orders were to observe, not intervene. The night he saw a child stare back at him through smoke, a child who didn't cry, even as her world burned. He blinked, and she was back, the girl in front of him now. Not that child, but bearing the same mark, the same haunted, knowing eyes. Outside, the wind shifted, and under Ida sound, hooves, slow, measured. At least 2 riders, maybe more. The crunch of ice under shod horseflesh. They weren't lost, not out here, not in this storm. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, settled in John's gut. He knew this sound. He knew what followed it. He walked to the door, rifle in hand. No hesitation this time. His hands were steady, breath calm. 12 years ago, he'd walked away from the world, from guilt, from fire. He tried to bury the past, to let the silence heal him. But now, there was a girl inside, a living, breathing echo of his failure. And something wicked behind her. Something he recognized. He opened the door just a crack, the freezing wind tearing at his face, and saw shadows at the tree line. Dark, indistinct shapes. Human. They were close. Too close. 12 years I stayed quiet. He muttered to himself, the words rough and unfamiliar on his tongue. But if you're here for her... The wind blew the rest of the sentence away, snatching it into the vast, indifferent wilderness. But the rifle was already raised, its cold steel a comfort in his grip. Because once he had watched a village burn. This time he'd see who set the match. The girl didn't stir through the night. John kept the fire alive, stoked like a man warding off spirits rather than cold. Outside, the wind carried snow sideways across the ridgeline, painting ghostly patterns on the frosted windows. He moved quietly, boiling water from melted snow, laying strips of deer jerky near the heat to soften. The old cast-iron kettle hissed a sound that, for a fleeting moment, reminded him of trains he never took, of a world he'd abandoned. Near dawn, she finally moved, a flinch, a moan, barely a breath. Her eyes blinked once, then again dark irises, sharp with instinct, the kind of eyes that didn't belong to children, but to survivors. He knelt by her with slow, deliberate hands. "Easy," he said, voice low, rough from years of disuse. "You're safe. For now." She looked around the cabin like an animal checking for exits, assessing every shadow, every creak of the old timber. She tried to sit up, winced, a soft gasp escaping her lips. The blood on her brow had dried, caked, and crusted into her temple. He offered her water, holding the tin cup steady. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between his face and the cup, a deep-seated distrust etched into her features. Then, driven by raw thirst, she drank, her throat working hard. No words passed between them for a while, only the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. John examined her injuries as best he could. A deep cut on her leg, poorly bandaged. Rope marks, raw and angry, on her wrists. The kind that don't come from playing games, but from being bound. He cleaned them with warm, clean water, his movements gentle, almost tender. He wrapped her wrist with torn flannel from his old shirt, the soft fabric, a stark contrast to the rough rope that had bitten into her skin. When she flinched violently at his touch, a sudden, animalistic jerk away, he set the bandage down and backed away, giving her space. He understood. He'd seen enough. He didn't ask who she was. Not yet. He had his guess. Apache, marked, scarred, maybe 15 winters old, though her eyes held the wisdom of 100. When she dozed again, a fitful, shallow sleep, he stared at her face too still, too silent, and it came back, like it always did. The smell of smoke, the sound of women crying. Orders in English barked with cold precision. Screams in Kirikahua, echoing in the valley of his mind, and a child stepped through him like she saw what kind of man he was. Useless, coward, bystander. He remembered kneeling beside another wounded girl, long ago, her hand crushed, bones shattered. He'd tried to speak, tried to help, but the translator never came, and his words were useless. All he could do was look, his eyes bearing witness to a horror he couldn't stop. That girl never blinked either, her gaze burning into his soul. Now here was another, alive, for now. And this time, he wouldn't just look. He rose and walked to the corner of the cabin, where he kept his wife's Bible covered in dust, but never discarded, a remnant of a life he'd thought long dead. He ran a finger along the spine, the leather soft beneath his touch. "If this is penance," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the wind, "then let me finish it proper." Outside, the snow was letting up. The wind no longer screamed, whispered. And somewhere in that whisper, he thought he heard it again. Hooves, lighter this time, farther away, but coming back. They would return. He knew it. By mid-morning, the storm had quieted, but the cold remained sharp as broken glass. Light filtered through frosted window panes, painting streaks of pale gold across the girl's face. She sat up slowly, watching him from beneath the buffalo hide blanket. Her hair hung in tangled black strands, one cheek bruised, swollen. In her lap lay the folded hide. John had wrapped her in handled now with a care that said she understood kindness, but didn't expect it. She was like a wild creature, wary but not broken. He broke the silence first. "What's your name?" She hesitated, her mouth parted, but no sound came, only a dry rasp. He nodded slowly, as if expecting that, giving her time. "You don't have to talk. Not yet." From the mantel, he took a small tin box. Inside, hard biscuits, a sliver of smoked trout, and a handful of pine nuts. He laid them before her, then stepped back, allowing her space. She stared at the food, her eyes narrowed. Then, like a wolf unsure of traps, she tested each bite with suspicion before hunger took over, devouring the meager offering. As she ate, John crouched by the hearth, pretending not to watch, but his eyes were fixed on her. His gaze caught a glint something hanging from a cord around her neck, not jewelry. A coin. Number. Not just any coin. A silver medallion, worn and blackened at the edges, engraved with an emblem he hadn't seen in years, TC, Thorn Consolidated. His jaw tightened. That company didn't just trade goods, they bought land, influence, silence, and the man behind it, Silas Thorn, wasn't known for mercy. A cold wave washed over John. Why would a girl from the White Mountain tribes carry Thorn's mark? Before he could ask, she spoke. Her voice was raspy, sun-cracked, but clear, cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. Lilith. He looked up, startled. My name, she said, her dark eyes meeting his, holding his gaze. Lilith. A name soaked in fire and grit. He didn't ask more, just nodded. John. She said nothing, but her gaze lingered on him longer than before, a silent assessment passing between them. Something about her posture shifted, still, cautious, but not cornered. Less like a hunted animal, more like a warrior at rest. Then she reached into the folds of her cloak, her movements deliberate, pulled out a folded piece of hide. When she unwrapped it, he saw a hand-drawn map, ink-faded, lines jagged like they'd been etched in panic, symbols scattered along a river. An X scratched near what looked like a canyon, ominous and foreboding. Next to it, scribbled in English, where they keep them. John stared at the map, then looked at her, his mind racing. Who's they? She didn't answer. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes hardening with a resolve born of pain. Outside, a branch cracked under the weight of lingering ice. The fire popped, a cheerful sound in the grim silence. Wind stirred snow from the windowsill, painting fleeting patterns on the glass. John stood, rifle in hand again, but slower this time, every muscle tensed. Who was chasing her? And what did they think she'd seen that was so important, so dangerous? Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. By the time dusk began bleeding into the valley, John had made his choice. This was no longer just about guilt, about penance. This was about right and wrong. He would see this through. He saddled the mare just after noon quietly, deliberately. She hadn't been ridden in over a month, but she knew the trail, knew the scent of snow, and knew her rider's weight like memory. Lilith stood near the door, still cloaked in the buffalo hide, eyes tracking his every motion, a silent question in their depths. We ride to the canyon, he said simply, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. She didn't flinch, just nodded once. She was still pale, but the biscuits and jerky had given her color, a flicker of life returning to her face. The map was tucked inside her cloak now, close to her chest, a precious, dangerous secret. John didn't know who she meant by they, not fully. But he'd seen enough in this world, lived through enough darkness, to know what kind of men stake hidden places on maps. Slavers, raiders, or worse, Thorn's men doing what the law dared not name, operating in the shadows of power. He helped her onto the saddle first, his hands briefly touching her waist, feeling the fragile strength beneath the hide. Then he climbed behind, wrapping one arm around to keep her steady, the warmth of her small body, a stark contrast to the biting cold. The frigid air bit at their faces, numbing their exposed skin, but the trail was clear, frozen hard under the wheels of something heavy that had passed through days before, leaving deep ruts in the hardened snow. They rode in silence for almost an hour, the only sounds the creak of leather and the muffled thud of the mare's hooves. Then the birds vanished. Not flew, vanished. The usual winter sounds of a chirping robin or a squawking jay simply ceased. An unnatural quiet descended upon the woods. John reined the mare hard, his heart already thudding against his ribs. The woods ahead were still, too still, holding their breath. He knew this sign. He knew what it meant. He turned to Lilith, his voice a low warning. "Hold on." She didn't ask why. Her eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the silent forest. 10 seconds later, the first shot cracked through the silence, splitting the branch of a pine inches from his head. The air exploded with noise. He didn't think. He kicked the mare hard, sending her off the trail and down a steep slope into the thicket, the mare scrambling for purchase on the icy ground. Bullets tore through the trees behind them, ripping through bark, spraying splinters. One sparked against stone, another ripped bark from a trunk directly where they'd been moments before. Lilith clung to him, face buried in his coat, her body trembling slightly. He didn't return fire. Not yet. Not until he knew where they were, how many there were. Half a mile down, he found a rocky outcrop where the horse could duck behind a towering boulder, offering a temporary shield. He dismounted fast, helped Lilith down, his own leg already protesting the jarring ride. Her breathing was fast but steady, no blood. He checked her quickly, relief washing over him. Then he circled back up the ridge, crawling through brush like he'd done back in Sonora, tracking rustlers with nothing but a knife and his gut, every sense sharpened. It took 10 minutes to spot them. 3 men, 2 rifles, one with a spyglass sweeping the woods, systematically searching for them. John noted the horses. Black coats, government brand. But the riders weren't law. Not with coats that clean and eyes that empty, devoid of anything resembling justice. They weren't hunting a fugitive, they were recovering property. He slid back down the ridge, his heart cold as the winter air. They know she's not dead, he thought. They're not trying to silence her. They're trying to bring her back, quietly. To put her back in her cage. Back at the outcrop, Lilith sat with knees to her chest, her small body curled against the cold rock. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not just fear but shame. Shame for being caught. Shame for the horror she carried. "Are they Thorne's men?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her scarred hands. He didn't press, just loaded 2 more rounds into the rifle. The familiar click of the mechanism, a grim promise. "We'll double back at nightfall," he said, sketching a route in the snow with his finger. "There's a pass east, might still be covered." She looked at Jaime, eyes no longer wild, just heavy with unspoken questions. "Why are you helping me?" John paused, the ghost of an old regret rising in his throat. "Because I didn't help the last one," he almost said. Instead, he met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting a newfound resolve. "Because if men like them win, there'll be no one left to bury what they destroy." Lilith didn't smile, but she nodded, a silent understanding passing between them deeper than any words. They moved after dark, hugging the timberline as the wind dropped to a whisper, the snow crunching softly underfoot. Lilith walked now quiet, nimble, and surprisingly fast, despite the bruises and her exhaustion. John led the mare by the reins, keeping to the trees and glancing back every 100 steps, searching for any sign of pursuit. The tracks they left weren't easy to read in moonlight, but John had done this before, back when he hunted men instead of game, when his life had a different purpose. He didn't like what he saw. "They're tracking," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Not guessing. They got a scout, maybe a half-blood with mountain skill." Lilith didn't speak, but her eyes narrowed, acknowledging his grim assessment. She pointed toward a creek up ahead, half frozen, running thin between boulders. John nodded. "Good call." They crossed upstream, wading through water so cold it cut through leather, numbing their feet. Lilith's teeth chattered as they climbed the opposite bank, but she never complained, never slowed. When they paused beneath a pine bluff, a temporary haven, John offered her a strip of jerky. She shook her head. "Save it." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a small tin from his saddlebag. Inside were wax matches, a flint, and a carved cross worn smooth from years of handling. He didn't light a fire, knowing the risk, just held the cross between his palms for a moment, his thumb tracing the worn wood, a silent plea, then returned it to the box. "One day, he whispered, almost too low to hear. "You'll owe me nothing, girl. But tonight, I owe him." At first light, they found the pass. A narrow trail carved between two ridges, half covered by fallen rock. It hadn't been used in years, which made it perfect, likely overlooked by their pursuers. John sent the mare ahead first. She climbed steady, ears twitching but hooves sure, sensing the urgency. Behind them, Lilith followed on hands and knees. When the trail narrowed, her breath short but determined, her movements surprisingly fluid despite the cold and her injuries. Then John saw it movement in the distance, a glint of glass, a rifle scope catching the weak morning sun. Too far to shoot, but close enough to mean trouble. He ducked low. So did Lilith, her reflexes honed by constant danger. "They've split up," he said, his voice flat. "They're flanking us from the east ridge." Lilith looked toward the canyon on the map, then back at him, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "We can't turn back." "No," John agreed, "but we can draw them." He reached into the saddlebag again, pulled out a small tin flask, filled with lamp oil. Then he unwrapped a bundle of fabric torn from an old Confederate uniform. He poured oil onto the rag, tied it to a stick, and tucked it into the crook of a pine branch up the ridge. It would burn bright, look like movement, enough to draw fire. "Get to the base of the canyon," he told her, his voice low and urgent. "Follow the stone wall. There's a bend it'll hide you." She hesitated, her gaze searching his. "What if they see through it?" "Then I'll be standing where they're looking." He smiled, faint and grim, a shadow of the man he once was. Before guilt consumed him, she stared at him longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement, a desperate plea, then said only, "Don't die." He chuckled dryly, not planning to. She disappeared into the shadows, a swift, silent movement. And John lit the rag. Flame jumped to life with a hiss, lighting the trees like a ghost rising, a beacon in the pre-dawn gloom. Within seconds, the echo of a shot rang through the canyon, missing by feet, not miles. John fired once in return, loud and deliberate, a challenge in the silence. Then he ran, not away, along the ridge, drawing fire like a decoy, like bait. For the first time in 12 years, he was back in the middle of the fight. And this time, he wasn't walking away. The gunfire stopped after 20 minutes. Then came the silence-a-not piece, but the kind that hangs in the air like smoke after something's burned. John circled back, breath ragged from the run, his lungs burning from the cold air. The decoy had worked. The pursuers had fired blindly, chasing shadows through pine and rock. But it had cost him. He'd twisted his ankle, sliding down a scree ridge, and now every step stabbed sharp up his leg, a searing pain that shot through his entire body. Still, he limped through the hollow where he'd told Lilith to wait, his eyes straining through the gloom. She wasn't there. At first, panic flickered a cold dread that tightened his chest bud only briefly. Then he heard it. A soft whistle woe short, one long. Apache field signal. Old as dust, passed down through generations. He followed the sound, relief washing over him. She was waiting in the lee of a red stone wall, crouched beside a brush-covered outcrop. In her hands, a leather pouch half opened. She didn't notice him at first. Her eyes were fixed on what lay inside. A ledger, bound in cracked cowhide. The spine stitched with initials. Ese, de, Silas, Thorn. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. John sat beside her, not touching, but close enough to read the lines, the cold seeping into his bones. What he saw made his gut twist. Dates, names, locations, and prices. Women, children, some marked with tribal symbols, some with just initials and numbers. Shipment schedules, names of buyers, not just criminals, judges, landowners, railroad men. The sheer scale of the evil made his stomach churn. He flipped a page and froze. Theriched in clear ink was the symbol of the U.S. Cavalry, an order signed by an officer he'd once served under, Lieutenant Colonel James Halworth. Beside the signature, cleared for temporary transfer of detainees, Fort Conrad to private holdings. John stared long, his mind reeling. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined. Not just Thorne, he said, his voice a low growl. Lilith nodded, her face grim. They sold us from behind desks. Her voice didn't break, it was flat, devoid of emotion. That scared him more than tears would have. He turned another page, found a name he hadn't heard in over a decade. Miller, clearance granted. His own. His breath caught. It wasn't him. Not directly. But someone had used his name, his clearance code from before he resigned. They'd kept it alive, to authorize movement, to cover their trail, to make him an unwitting accomplice. He slammed the book shut, the sound echoing in the silent hollow. They used me. Lilith looked at him calm, unreadable, her dark eyes holding his gaze. "Are you still one of them?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was an echo, like she'd asked herself the same of every white man she'd ever met, a question born of generations of broken promises. He shook his head. "Number." She stared. "Then prove it." He handed her the book. "Hold this close. It's more than proof. It's poison. Anyone who sees it dies or kills to keep it secret." She slipped it into her satchel. No words, just a nod, a silent vow. The sun was rising now, streaking red along the canyon walls, painting the grim scene with a deceptive beauty. He looked at her. "Why do you have this?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "Because I took it." "Took it?" "From Thorne's camp. Before they killed my sister." John didn't move, not even to breathe, his blood running cold. Her name was Sani. Her voice was quiet, a whisper of a lost life. She tried to run. I followed. She didn't make it. I did. John closed his eyes, the image of that burning village, of Sani's desperate run, clearer than ever. "Then we don't just run," he said, his voice raw with a newfound purpose. "We finish it." She looked up, her eyes burning with fierce determination. "How?" He smiled. Grim, a warrior's smile. "We bring them to light." From the canyon below came a new sound wheels on gravel, a wagon train, maybe 3, moving slow, laborious. John picked up the spyglass. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Cages, chains, covered wagons marked with government seals, a cruel mockery of authority. More children, pale, terrified faces peering out from behind bars. He lowered the glass, his jaw tight. "We've got one chance," he said, his voice flat with grim resolve. "One chance to burn this down." They waited until dusk, crouched in the hollow above the canyon bend, watching the wagons creak through gravel and scrub, heading deeper into the isolated terrain. John studied the layout, like a battlefield. 3 wagons, 2 with cages, the third likely for guards or supplies. 6 riders, total 4 with rifles, 2 trailing on foot. Thorne's mark burned fresh on every panel, black ink on canvas, a brand of ownership. "This ain't a transport," John whispered, the words filled with loathing. "It's a relocation, a slow march to death in the desert." Lilith said nothing, just watched, her eyes mirroring his anger. Then, in a voice barely louder than wind, "They won't survive the desert." She meant the children. He scanned the ridges, measuring distance, wind direction, sun angle. He counted bullets in his Belton. Maybe 12 if the misfired shell would hold. "Too many to fight straight on," he muttered, weighing the odds. Lilith reached into her satchel and pulled out a glass bottle with a cork. It sloshed thick, amber liquid. John raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his grim face. "Turpentine. From Thorne's supply camp. I took it." He smiled, not out of joy, but recognition, a spark of cunning. "Fire." She nodded, her eyes fierce. "You said we burn it down." 15 minutes later, they moved like shadows. John looped around west, flanking down the ridge. Lilith slid east, hugging brush, her movements silent as a ghost. Each carried one of the 3 bottles she'd saved, soaked with cloth wicks. Their plan wasn't to kill, not yet, just to scatter the hornet's nest. As the last light of day slipped behind the peaks, John struck the first match. The cloth caught fast. He lobbed it high into the canvas side of the nearest wagon. The bottle shattered, flame licking up the frame like it had waited years for this moment. Screams followed, horses neighed. From the other side, Lilith's flame lit the second wagon. John used the chaos. He slipped toward the third wagon unchained. No guards. Inside, 5 children. No older than 10. Faces pale, eyes wide with terror and a glimmer of hope. One reached through the bars, fingers bloodied from futile attempts to escape. John didn't speak, just fired at the lock. It shattered with a sharp crack. "Go," he rasped, his voice rough. "Run northeast, Creek Trail, hide in the rocks." The oldest girl, barely more than a child herself, nodded. She herded the rest like a mother wolf, her tiny flock vanishing into the approaching darkness within seconds. Then came the shout, "John Miller!" A voice like rusted iron, filled with rage. He turned. Silas Thorne stood beyond the firelight, that low, coat-heavy, rifle steady, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You're meddling again, Miller," Thorne called, his voice booming across the canyon. John stepped forward, shotgun raised but not fired. A silent challenge. "You used my name," he said, his voice a low growl, each word a stone falling. "My clearance, my honor." Thorne smiled, a predator's grin, unconcerned by the burning wagons. "You gave it up, remember? Honor's what's left when men stop digging graves." Thorne raised his rifle butt. John was faster. The shot echoed like a thunderclap, sharp and final. Thorne dropped. Dead? Maybe. John didn't wait to confirm. He grabbed Lilith's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Run!" They vanished into the smoke, the blaze marking their trail, a fiery defiance in the gathering night. They ran through smoke and dusk, feet slicing through sagebrush and stone, every muscle screaming in protest. Behind them, chaos brewed, burning canvas, panicked horses, shouts of retreat and rage. The canyon echoed with confusion, no clear orders, no organized pursuit. But it wouldn't last. Men like Hallworth didn't stay disoriented long. They had minutes, maybe less. John's leg burned. The old sprain was tearing now. Every step was fire, sending searing pain up his leg, threatening to buckle him. Lilith stayed close, one hand steadying him when he stumbled, her touch a silent anchor. Her rifle bounced on her back, the satchel heavy on her shoulder. They reached the base of an outcropping-like red rock rising into shadow. John knew this place. It was where he used to bring salt down from the mesa. A dead-end trail for wagons, but not for men with nothing left to lose. "We climb," he said, his voice raspy. Lilith glanced behind, her eyes alert in the dim light. "They'll follow. Let 'em." He started first, one hand gripping a cracked edge, the other dragging his weight up inch by inch, muscles screaming with effort. Lilith followed with less noise, more grace, her slender body moving with surprising agility. The girl moved like stone knew her name. Halfway up, they heard it. Voices. Below. Close. Then a shot. It cracked stone inches from Lilith's heel. She slipped. John caught her arm, his grip like iron, muscles screaming from the strain. He pulled. Hard. She cleared the ledge, just as another bullet sparked off the cliff behind her. They lay flat for a moment, gasping, their breaths ragged. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice strained. John nodded, eyes scanning the dark horizon. But maybe we don't have to." He pointed toward a narrow split in the ridge. "There's a cave up there. Used it once during the floods." They moved fast, crawling now, every breath rasped like knives in his ribs. The cave wasn't much, just a hollow in the stone, barely enough for them both to squeeze into. But it had one thing, a back entrance. A narrow slit that led to a dry ravine, if you knew how to squeeze through. They collapsed inside, bodies aching, lungs burning. John braced his back against the wall, rifle across his lap, its cold steel a familiar weight. Lilith sat opposite, hands on her knees, her gaze fixed on him. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice soft, barely a whisper in the echoing darkness of the cave. After all those years, he didn't answer at first, the question hanging heavy in the air. Then, because the first time, I stood by, watched them burn homes, cage children. I followed orders, told myself it was temporary. It wasn't. The words were a confession, dredged from the deepest parts of his soul. Lilith was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, "Sonny screamed for me. I didn't answer. I kept running." "You were a child," John said, his voice thick with empathy. "So were they," she whispered, her eyes far away, remembering horrors. They sat in silence, both knowing the truth. Guilt doesn't measure itself. It simply exists, a burden shared. Outside, footsteps crunched. Closer now, cave ahead. A voice barked, sharp and confident. John raised his rifle, checking the chamber. 3 shots left. He looked at her. "Take the ledger. Through the back slit. Don't stop." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I'm buying time." She reached into the satchel, pulled the book out, its cowhide cover worn smooth, paused, then handed him something else. A folded paper, torn, blood-stained. He opened it. A sketch of a child, smiling, holding a flower. "She drew that," Lilith said, her voice breaking just a little. "Before they took her." John stared long, his gaze fixed on the innocent drawing, nodded once, a silent promise, then rose, back against stone, facing the entrance. Outside, the boots drew closer, the sound amplified by the confined space. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. If this was his end, at least it would be facing forward. John crouched near the mouth of the cave, rifle cradled in his arms, every muscle taut as drawn wire. The fire from the burning wagons still stained the sky behind them with smoke and the scent of scorched canvas, a grim reminder. The footsteps outside slowed 3, maybe 4 men, their voices sharp, tense. "Check the rocks. He's in there." He braced himself. Behind him, Lilith whispered, "They'll see the cracks soon. Then you better be gone before they do." She didn't move. "Go, Lilith." A long breath. Then he heard her squeeze into the back slit, the dry brush cracking underfoot as she disappeared into the darkness. He counted the seconds then, 20, 30. Then the first silhouette filled the mouth of the cave. John fired. The man screamed, stumbled back into another boat, tumbled from the ledge. A third fired blindly into the cave, but the shot cracked uselessly against stone. John ducked behind the outcropping. 2 bullets left. Enough, Halworth's voice boomed, chillingly familiar. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." "I've been outnumbered before," John retorted, his voice thin but steady. Silence. Then a faint rustle behind him. He turned, ready to shoot, but it was Lilith. She'd come back. "Mules tied near the ravine," she whispered, her eyes urgent. "We have seconds." John wanted to argue, to tell her she should have kept running, to save herself, but there was no time. He grabbed the ledger, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and followed. They slipped through the slit just as another shot rang out behind them, echoing in the narrow space, down the ravine, over dry stone, through twisted sage and into the brush. Then came the Howells dogs, released from Thorne's camp. They barked wildly, scenting blood, their baying growing closer. Lilith whistled twice. A dark shape answered from the trees, the mare, waiting like she'd always known they'd return. John swung up, then hauled Lilith after him. She kicked the mare, hard, urging her forward. They galloped into the dark, a desperate escape. Bullets whizzed through branches. A dog leapt at John's leg, kicked it midair. Another lunged, caught a stirrup. Lilith fired her last round, a sharp crack in the night. The bark turned into a yelp, and then silence. They kept riding, for hours. When dawn came, the world had changed. They crossed into sacred groundland, claimed by no man, where smoke curled from the fires of an old Apache family who owed John a debt, perhaps from that long-ago night. They were safe. For now. He slid from the saddle, leg bloody, ribs bruised, eyes burning. Lilith stood beside him, the ledger pressed against her chest, a symbol of their burden and their purpose. "You came back," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue and awe. She didn't smile. "So did you." They didn't say anything else. They didn't have to. The fire was gone, but its scent lingered on their clothes, in their hair, in their skin. They sat by the old fire pit in silence, ringed by ancient stones and the watchful eyes of those who had come before, warriors whose names lived only in wind and prayer. John poured water over the wound on his leg. Lilith bandaged it without a word, her fingers steady and strong. The ledger lay between them, closed, but heavy as a curse. For the first time since they'd met, John spoke not as a fighter, but as a man carrying the full weight of memory and a newfound resolve. "They'll keep coming." Lilith nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Unless we stop them." He looked into the fireless pit, saw not ashes but a choice. "We take this to the capital," he said. "We show them, all of it." Lilith didn't hesitate. "Then we finish it." The path ahead was not safe. But for the first time, they walked toward it together. The town appeared on the horizon like a scar too deep to heal. Garlands for Conce, a frontier promise, now a frontier pawn. Its church steeple pierced the overcast sky, the bell silent, rusted by too many lies. John and Lilith rode in at dusk, dust and cold, clinging to their coats like memory. Marshal Riggins had ridden ahead to alert the courthouse. He'd said he still had men inside, said the judge was honest, said a lot of things John used to believe. They stopped at the edge of town, beside the cemetery. John dismounted slowly. His legs still ached from the canyon. Lilith joined him, eyes following his gaze. "You knew someone here?" John nodded. "A boy, Jimmy Kincaid, died trying to stop a raid Thorne paid for, got buried under accidental fire." Lilith stared at the crooked headstone, its letters worn by wind. Then she asked, quiet, "And now?" John didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, not the child she'd been, but the survivor she was becoming. "I'm not here to bury the past anymore," he said. "I'm here to unearth it." They walked into Garland's Fork, like ghosts returned from a war everyone tried to forget. People turned, doors shut, a curtain twitched. In this town, silence had always been louder than gunfire. Outside the courthouse, a man waited. Thorne, dressed in his Sunday best, smiled like a preacher with a loaded sermon. Beside him stood two deputies' new faces, not local law. "Marshall said you had something for me, Miller," Thorne called out. Voice too casual, too confident. John stepped forward. "I do." He held out the ledger. One of the deputies moved, but Thorne held up a hand. He took the book, flipped through it, didn't even blink. "Looks like notes. Scribbles, nothing binding." Lilith's eyes flared. "It's proof. Ledgers. Testimony." Thorne smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "Of what? Work contracts? Old tribal debts? You think a jury here'll read that and cry for savages?" John's voice dropped low, a dangerous rumble. "They won't cry, but they'll hang you for what's in there." A new voice cut through the tension. "I'll see to that." Judge Morris, elderly, tired, but honest. He stepped down the courthouse steps, flanked by Riggins and two armed marshals. "You're under arrest, Mr. Thorne," Morris said, calm as a sunrise, his voice carrying authority, "for conspiracy, kidnapping, manslaughter, and obstruction of federal law." The smirk faded. One deputy raised a rifle butt. Riggins was faster. The shot knocked the man clean from his boots. The other dropped his weapon. Thorne's eyes darted, calculating, desperate. He turned to run. John moved. Faster than he had any right to, the rifle slung behind his shoulder now gripped in both hands. He didn't fire, just swung it like a club. The butt caught Thorne square in the chest, dropping him to his knees. Lilith stepped forward, stood over the man who had hunted her kin, bought silence with bullets, and called it justice. She didn't speak, didn't need to. John looked at her, then back to Thorn. "There's no more running." And in that moment, something in the town shifted. A woman opened her shop door. A man stepped onto his porch. The silence broke not in sound, but in presence. Garland's fork was watching, and this time, it wouldn't look away. The courtroom smelled of old wood and coal ash. It creaked, like it remembered every lie ever spoken beneath its rafters. Thorn sat in the defendant's chair, hands cuffed, jaw clenched, still defiant, still calculating. But his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't in control anymore. Judge Morris looked weary behind the bench. Not just old, but heavy, with years of verdicts passed and justice delayed. Marshal Riggins stood near the door, arms crossed, his gaze steady. The gallery was nearly full. Whispers spread like wildfire. Townsfolk who'd never stepped inside this place now crowded the pews. Word had traveled fast. Thorn's been caught. There's a girl. The ledger tells all. Lilith sat near the front, pale, composed. The silver medallion glinted faintly beneath her collar. John stood in the witness box. The Bible beneath his hand felt heavier than it should have. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor asked. "John Hawk Miller." "And your former title?" "Captain 9th Cavalry." A murmur ran through the gallery. "And your connection to the accused?" John looked across the room, eyes locking with Thorn's. "We served under the same orders." But he kept following them long after the war ended. The ledger lay open on the table between them. The prosecutor lifted it, showing a page of names: Apache, Comanche, Navajo, ink smudged by time, but legible. "These notations are they consistent with Thorn's handwriting?" John nodded. "Yes, and the symbols match his ranch's branding codes." "Would you say this constitutes proof of an organized system of forced labor and illegal confinement?" "I would." Judge Morris scribbled a note. Then came the defense attorney, slick, confident, paid for in cattle and fear. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice oily, "you expect us to believe you a man with a record of disobedience, dishonorable discharge, and a known reclusier, suddenly the voice of moral clarity?" John didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to believe the dead." A pause, chilling. The lawyer pressed harder. "How convenient this ledger just appears. Carried in by a girl who can't even prove her name." Lilith stood. She didn't wait for permission. "My name was taken when they took my mother, but the scars on my back, those are real enough." She unbuttoned the collar of her dress, turned slightly. The room gasped. John looked down, ashamed he hadn't asked her to stop. But Lilith didn't stop. "His men came at night. They branded the children who didn't work fast enough. They told us we were animals, worth less than the land." The prosecutor gently motioned for her to sit again, but the silence held, reverent, unflinching. Finally, Judge Morris spoke. "I've heard enough." He turned to Thorn. "Do you wish to testify?" Thorn stood. "No man who tamed this land did so with clean hands. I built this town. I fed your families, kept order when no one else would. And now I'm on trial for it?" He looked at the crowd. "Where were you when the Apache raided your cattle, when lawlessness ruled?" John rose. "They weren't raids. They were retaking what was stolen." And Lilith added, soft but firm, "And lawlessness ruled because men like you wrote the laws." Judge Morris slammed his gavel once. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning, when I render judgment." As the room emptied, John and Lilith stood together, not in triumph, but in the long, quiet space where truth finally echoes. The morning broke cold and gray. Garland's fork awoke in a hushed silence, doors opening slowly, not from habit, but from hope. Inside the courthouse, tension hung thick as smoke. Thorn sat in chains, drained but no longer defiant. Lilith, in her simple dress, stood unbending, a pillar of quiet strength. John sat beside her, looking cleaner, not from water, but from a newfound clarity that comes only after walking through fire. Judge Morris entered, his gaze fixed on the weathered ledger before him. He cleared his throat, glanced down at the weathered pages of the ledger, then to the notes scribbled in a trembling hand. "This court," he began, "has spent the past day reviewing not only testimony, but the patterns of silence, the legacy of abuse, and the long, terrible shadow cast over this town. He paused. In the case of Silas Thorne, this court finds the defendant guilty on all charges. The room exhaled as one. Thorne slumped forward. No outburst, no protest, just the quiet defeat of a man who thought the world would never change and was wrong. But the judge wasn't done. Yet, Morris said, punishment is only one part of justice. He looked at John and Lilith. Reckoning is another. He stood, slowly. This court grants temporary custody of the Thorne estate pending federal review to Miss Lilith Gray Hawk and the Apache Trust for reparations and restoration of tribal property. The land will not be healed in a day, but perhaps today is a start. The courtroom stirred again, but softer this time. Reverent. Riggins gave John a nod. One of respect, one of thanks. Lilith didn't smile. She stepped forward. I don't want his land, she said. I want it returned, to those who bled for it, to the families still searching the arroyos for bones. The judge nodded. That will be recorded. Then he turned to John. You came back. You didn't have to. Why? John stood slowly, hat in hand. I once believed men like me couldn't change the story. We just survived it. But I was wrong. He looked at Lilith. Sometimes the story changes you. The judge asked one final question. And what do you intend to do now, Mr. Miller? John looked around the room at the townspeople, at the empty benches where no one used to sit, at the sun now filtering faintly through the windows. I reckon I'll stay. He turned to Lilith. If she'll let me help rebuild what I helped break. Lilith said nothing, but her hand found his, and she didn't let go. Outside, snow had begun to fall, not heavy, but soft. Like the land was exhaling, too. People stepped from porches. Children watched without fear. The bell of the old church rang one seats, voice cracked, but still whole. In the sky, a hawk circled high, free and silent. John looked up and whispered, more to the wind than anyone else. Maybe that's what grace feels like. The fire had died down. The gunpowder smoke cleared, but what remained were ashes of reckoning and the tender roots of something new. They began with the schoolhouse, a place where Apache and settler children would learn not just letters, but how to sit beside one another without fear. Lilith took over Thorne's old ranch house, transforming it into the resting house, a shelter where survivors found their voices and learned their scars were not shame, but maps of where they'd come from. John worked alongside her, side by side, building not just structures, but trust. The town, Garland's Fork, slowly, stubbornly, began to remember, to heal, to live in a truth it had long buried. John no longer slept with a weapon by his bed, and sometimes, in the quiet evenings, watching Lilith with the girls, he knew the world was mending. Not quickly, not easily, but honestly. And that, too, was grace. For what endures is not the land, but how we choose to live upon it. For those who've lived long enough to know that scars don't always fade, and that sometimes silence tells the truest stories, this tale may feel like a mirror, not just of the Old West, but of our own hearts. The creak of saddles, the cold wind off the plains, the quiet dignity of men and women trying to do right in a world built wrong. These aren't just details, they're memories. Perhaps that's why true Wild West stories still matter, because they remind us that redemption isn't loud, justice isn't always swift, and real faith isn't about never falling, but about rising again, quietly, stubbornly, with grace. If you've ever lost someone, carried regret, or simply looked back on the long trail of your life and wondered if it meant something, this story was written for you. And maybe, just maybe, like John Hawk Miller, we're all still learning to rebuild what we helped break, one act of kindness at a time.